Hello and welcome to the 5, 8 and a half, your midweek break. I'm Lisa Graves along with Nadine Smith, and I want to thank Greg Oliar and Elby for inviting us to host this Wednesday night show. Before we get to 5 stories, 8 minutes, where we slow things down and refuel, reflect, and remember that you're not alone and the glass is half full, we want to just check in. So, Nadine, how are you doing?
How am I doing? Well, you know what? I joined the legions who are right now in the battle for their lives against pollen.
Yes.
If you see that my eyes are bright red, do not assume that it's 420 somewhere. I have simply
It is
been
420 somewhere, though.
ravaged by pollen. So,
Yeah.
how about you?
The pollen has been coming down from the oak trees here in just waves. So it is that season. In the northern part of the country, spring has finally sprung and leaves are on the trees, which is super exciting. But that's the most exciting thing, because this week has been just hour after hour of more ridiculousness from Trump, including I just read before we came on the air just the outrage that not only is Trump considering pardoning some reality stars who, bilked people out of money at community banks, but he's also, quote, thinking about pardoning the men who tried to kidnap and threaten the murder of Michigan Governor Big Gretch. Like, it's just so fundamentally immoral and outrageous and just vile for him to even say that he's thinking about pardoning those men. Of course, he already pardoned a bunch of other violent people like Stuart Rhodes and other people who were convicted of violence in attacking our Capitol. But to actually consider pardoning people who were planning the kidnap of a sitting U.S. governor, it's like another step beyond the pale, but we're already outside the pale. Or inside the pale.
Is there any pale? Yeah, I'm not sure there's any pale left. And to make it all the more disgusting, he's doing it in such an obvious pay-to-play way. Like this guy, Paul Walczak, who built his employees out of millions and millions of dollars, pretending to pay Social Security, pretending to, pay health insurance, and instead he spent it on yachts and, luxury vacations. His mom pays $1 million to go to a face-to-face at Mar-a-Lago. 3 weeks later, not only does Trump pardon this guy, he pardons him in a way that he's not even required to pay restitution. So, yes, we are so far beyond the pale that the pale cannot be seen from here.
Yes, it is. It's extraordinary because, one of the things that really struck me last year during the oral arguments around the immunity case, where, John Roberts ultimately orchestrated this counter-constitutional, anti-constitutional criminal immunity for Donald Trump, was the underlying assumption that the pardon power is beyond sort of court review. So in essence, the baseline was before that decision that presidents could pardon, and it was a power that could not be reviewed, that it could not somehow be corrupt. And that was the sort of outer line. And then John Roberts came in and said, no, there's really no line. We'll just call anything an official act. And if it's an official act, then the president can't be charged for any criminal behavior. Whereas I think that the line on pardons also should include that you can't pardon someone in a way that basically constitutes a bribe. Why should that be allowed? We actually need to revisit that thing as a whole. And these pardons that Trump has been thinking about and doing are just so blatantly and obviously corrupt that it is literally revolting, figuratively revolting. It's revolting. Yeah. And that the law actually should catch up with reality, which is, sure, you can pardon someone. You can give an act of grace to commute someone's sentence or release someone who you think is has served their time or is remorseful. But the idea that you could give a pardon after receiving a gift from their parent, from their mom or their relative, or some other secret, who knows what Bitcoin nonsense going on behind the scenes, it is just so blatantly corrupt that it's like we've lost. I feel like there aren't enough words for corruption to describe how corrupt this is.
Well, hopefully people will begin to see that every time he's given a choice, he always chooses a path that puts money in the pockets of the people who benefit him, and takes money out of the pockets of the rest of us. Speaking of taking money out of the pockets of the rest of us, what's our first topic for today? And shall we set the timer?
Yes, I'm going to set the timer. The first topic is Medicaid and the raid on Medicaid. This is really something that is extraordinary. So at the time that we have this massive grift happening at the White House, we also have this pressure from the White House to the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans to adopt this ridiculous, outrageous bill. Trump is calling it the big, beautiful bill. It's really the billionaire bailout bill. It's more about basically making these tax cuts permanent, the ones that Charles Koch helped orchestrate in the first Trump administration, and make those permanent, add that to our deficit, while then cutting benefits for people who are in the most vulnerable circumstance. So Medicaid is something that, a huge number of Americans rely upon. 70 million Americans, more than 70 million Americans rely on it. And in addition to that, children rely on it in addition to the Children's Health Insurance Program, which I worked on back in the Clinton administration to try to get that Children's Health Insurance Program, that CHIP, adopted in the States. And when you look at the numbers, it's just astonishing. Almost half of all births in America, 40%, are paid in part by Medicaid. 50% of the births in rural areas are paid by Medicaid. 10% of the people on Medicaid are disabled, are contending with, enormous life challenges in terms of mobility and access to the workforce and more. And then you have this outrageous bill that comes through, and based on the terms in the House bill, nearly 12 million people will lose their coverage on Medicaid. Now, when you think about Medicaid, to me, I think about, okay, well, who's on Medicaid? Well, the baseline for Medicaid is the federal poverty level. So it's basically within 130 some percent of the federal poverty level, which is $20,000 a year in earnings for a single person. That's just above making the minimum wage, or you're making the minimum wage and you're working a second job and getting additional income in, or you have a little bit of overtime. That's what the basic poverty level in the United States is about $15,000 a year. So $20,000 a year for a single person. It's like $32,000 a year as a poverty level for a family of four. In this country where housing costs so much, that's the gross income. That's not the net income. That's not after, they're paying in Social Security or Medicaid. And so this bill that would take away health insurance access through Medicaid for millions of Americans, it is repulsive. And it is in a bill that is designed to have huge giveaways for Trump's friends, and even people who aren't Trump's friends, like Charles Koch, but who is perfectly happy to benefit from Trump being in office by, having this captured Supreme Court, and also by having this bill that is not a big, beautiful bill, but one that is really a reward for the billionaires and the kids of billionaires and the grandkids of billionaires. It is such a giveaway. It is just beyond outrageous. Yeah.
It really is. And I think we've said this before, but it bears repeating. Because, more than 20 million people have lost coverage since the pandemic protections ended. And in state after state, the numbers aren't dropping because people are ineligible. They're dropping because of clerical errors, lost paperwork, and deliberate state policies that make it harder to stay enrolled. Yeah. So I think that the Kaiser Family Foundation said as of May 2025, somewhere around 23.1 million people have been disenrolled from Medicaid. This is since the end of the COVID era continuous enrollment. And they did it by, and again, these are system breakdowns, states losing contact information, paperwork errors, and creating these really impossible deadlines, like telling people they've got 10 days and there's no online option for turning your paperwork in. So Texas has dropped over 1.6 million. About 600,000 of those are kids, and Florida is right behind with 1.4 million. Half those disenrolled in Arkansas are children. We really have to get to the place of understanding that the entire premise of DOGE, all of these things they say about being pro-natal and wanting, they're doing everything to make it impossible. And the thing that you don't have to be on Medicaid to be hurt by these decisions. There are going to be rural hospitals all over the country that are going to shut down because of the way that they are slashing Medicaid. And there are going to be people who don't know they're removed until they can be removed even while actively receiving care, whether it's chemotherapy or dialysis. And this, what did you call it? The billionaire bailout?
Yeah, bill? Billionaire bailout bill. Yeah.
It calls for $2 trillion in federal spending cuts over the next decade. That is, effectively going to roll back and shift the burden onto state budgets that won't be able to do it. And really where it's going to shift it to is on families themselves. So it doesn't, you don't have to be, there will be people who will not be able to get to the hospital in time to have a baby because that rural hospital, I see in the comments, somebody said 12 hospitals in rural Pennsylvania shut down as a consequence of this. And so, yes, we all are going to be hurt, and the most vulnerable among us are going to be hurt the most.
Yeah, it's just extraordinary. 10% of the people who are in nursing homes have Medicaid. Many others have Medicare, but 10%. So you have elderly individuals who need that care. You have young parents who need that access, and it's just callous and brutal. And it also just reveals the lie that any of these Republicans give a damn about the deficit. It's never about the deficit. They claim they need to cut all these costs, but that they spare no penny when it comes to giving tax cuts to the billionaires. That can jack the deficit up endlessly. But how dare we provide, just a baseline level of care to the most vulnerable among us, to kids who are growing up in poverty, to the elderly who are in poverty, to people who have disabilities. It is just shocking. It's not over yet, though. And so let me end this on a positive note, which is it hasn't passed the Senate. It has passed the House. There are, Republicans in the Senate who could buck it and join Democrats in voting against it. I think this bill is ultimately going to be one of the most unpopular bills coming into the 2026 election if it is adopted, because it is just a sledgehammer. It sort of takes that Doge sledgehammer that Trump empowered Musk to do to attack our federal government, to attack the agencies that serve us and provide access, and really target it at people on Medicare and Medicaid. And as you said, Nadine, people who can't meet the grace period, like their spouse dies and they're dealing with the funeral and say, I didn't get in time on the time period to get Medicaid suddenly when they were losing insurance, from their spouse. This is the real world for real people across the country in rural areas, urban areas, suburban areas. And if they have the audacity to pass Trump's bill, I hope they all pay for it at the ballot box. That's just, and I think people do need to call their senators and say, do not, under any circumstances, allow this bill to go forward.
The billionaire bailout bill.
Yes, the BBB. It's all bad.
All right. I'm gonna make that, I'm gonna say it over and over again until it just rolls off the tongue.
Billionaire bailout bill.
This bill is so bad that even Elon Musk criticized Trump.
Yeah.
Right? It said this was going to explode the deficit, undo all of the work of Doge, which of course the work of Doge is complete fiction anyway. But yes. So speaking of unexpected critiques emerging from besties, we have seen the next item. We called it. What did we call it? Emo
Trump. Yes.
Yeah. So the world watched in horror as Russian missile strikes leveled a children's hospital in Kiev, Ukraine. At least 31 people, including children and medical staff, were killed. And Trump, somebody who has been a champion of Putin, somebody who has referred to him as savvy and who took the time of Zelensky's visit to berate him and basically tell him to capitulate. In a campaign stop, Trump referred to Putin as a little bit crazy. Those words. The Kremlin's official response was to basically mock Trump as emotional and unbalanced. And so, I mean, you would like to think that this hospital, one of the largest pediatric facilities in Ukraine, with all of these videos circulating that are just heartbreaking, surgeries on children being conducted in courtyards, staff digging through the rubble to rescue newborns from intensive care. These, you would like to believe that at long last there's some, that it has touched Trump, deeply enough that he would turn on his mentor, his what do you, I don't know, what do you call somebody who sponsors you into the mob? If
Yeah,
it
know.
was vampires, he'd be his anyway. But I mean, yes, this is somebody. Trump has called Putin a genius and savvy, and repeatedly undercut NATO. And all of these things, and yet here he is criticizing Putin, and Putin basically said, "Yeah, he's a little emotional." He called him a little emo baby boy that needed to, maybe quiet down and let the adults handle things. So here's the question, and I would love for people to comment on this. And while you're commenting, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell, and that way you'll get notified about this show and the 5/8. But is this all theater? Is this the occasional pretense of distance between them, for theatrical benefit, or are we seeing are we seeing the clash of egos actually creating a gap and distance between them?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that it seems a little bit like theater to me, in the sense that Trump is dismantling America from the inside out and the outside in. He's destroying our alliances. He's, setting up massive obstacles to students studying in the United States. He's, cutting off funding for cancer research and more at Harvard. He's undermining the pillars of civil society. Basically, Trump is enacting Putin's agenda for destabilizing America step by step. I almost feel like some days it's like Trump is the demolition crew and he's setting these charges at each corner of the skyscraper that is America. And I, fear for the day that the skyscraper falls. But that's what Putin's agenda has been. Basically, his whole career has been how to destabilize America. And Trump has been a useful idiot in that sense in Putin's agenda. And Trump perhaps doesn't realize, I don't know whether he does realize that he is playing that useful idiot role. I mean, I think he knows I'm sure that in my personal opinion, he's compromised. And his behavior toward Putin demonstrates that over and over again. And then you have these other elements where I think Greg wrote a piece or maybe spoke a piece about how, Trump seems like he's trying to enact also 1984, like divide the world in three, where China has part of the world, the US has part of the world, Russia has part of the world. And these sort of authoritarian regimes will just dominate in these zones of influence, even as he expresses this deep antagonism for China and typically not for Putin. But it's also the case that, the bombing is just so outrageous. Maybe somehow, despite all the times in which Trump is not outraged by bombings, this somehow wrecked his plan or the narrative or whatever the TV show script that he had in mind. And so Putin's not on his script, not on the script that Trump wants right now, at this moment, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I will say this because yes, I see this as potentially theater, but we're also talking about somebody so thin-skinned and so egotistical who needs constant fawning. And did Putin, as he claimed he was going to usher in peace, make him look like a liar and a fool? And did he lash out? So, I think that it's important for us to pay attention, not to take seriously that Elon Musk is really going at Trump, or that Trump is separating from Putin in some meaningful way. But these are the gaps. This is the daylight between them that is worth seeking ways to widen, because at the end of the day, these are people of extraordinary ego, thin-skinned, and Putin's right, emotional at the end of the day. And so worth tracking.
Yeah. And I was going to say, Greg, I wrote a note in the comments to say he didn't write it. Tim wrote it. So thanks, Tim, writing it, and thanks, Greg, for. But I think we talked about it, and so it really made an impression on me, Greg. But that's right. I really take your point, Nadine, that like there is some gap, and it's worth acknowledging that, and perhaps there's some sunlight that can flow through that gap. Maybe there's some hope in some way on that front.
Well, and let's also leave open this possibility for anyone who just watched Trump's speech at West Point. Just diminished capacity, just complete. I was watching the Trump speech at West Point. That's my nice segue, so I can take us to the next point and bring on our guest. But honestly, I was watching it and I was thinking the word that kept popping into my head was nincompoop. This guy's a nincompoop. The nincompoopery of it, just the everything that he was just spewing was just ridiculous. And to think that 4 years at a military academy, the pinnacle of it is having to sit, being required to sit and listen to this ridiculous babbling nincompoop. And I thought to myself, you know what? I don't even know the origin of a nincompoop. So I looked it up and it was diminished mental capacity. So, but I want to focus on the cadets. Nincompoopy pants, somebody wrote. Because, cadets are taught to uphold a code. A cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate amongst those who do. They also take an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And here's somebody who's a liar, a cheat, and who has basically said the Constitution is kind of optional. So what it raises to me as we look at this group of future leaders is, what will they do when the illegal order comes? And to speak to that, joining us tonight is Lisa Bobing-Lernet, a veteran of both the military and law enforcement. She's a former Army soldier trained at the U.S. Army Intelligence School, and she served at Fort Meade, and she spent 25 years with the Tampa Police Department, where she led community policing initiatives, domestic violence, outreach, and offender monitoring programs that earned federal recognitions. She retired as a senior sergeant and now writes and speaks about law enforcement accountability, constitutional duty, and resisting political pressure that undermines ethical public service. So welcome to the show, Lisa. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So full disclosure, you and I know each other. We go way, way back, and I've seen you in a lot of these battles, both before you retired, being willing to take on the brass around things that you saw as unethical. But since retirement, you have really jumped headfirst into this conversation about, the old saying, if you have one bad cop and 9 good cops that let that bad cop go, then you really have 10 bad cops, right? So talk about, as you watch the West Point and as you look at what's unfolding with Trump pardoning the Capitol Police, the people who attacked, maimed, and led to the death of Capitol Police, what goes through your head, and how do we begin to have the conversation about what they will do when the illegal order inevitably comes?
Well, it's a great question, and I appreciate you bringing up the topic, because I think you and I do know each other long enough that you know that when Trump first was elected the first time, I posted that on social media to my law enforcement friends. What are you going to do, because it's coming? And the sad thing that I saw when I did watch the entire West Point speech, because I kind of torture myself in those ways. I like to see things for myself and hear, not to have people tell me what he said or anything. But what disturbed me was when he was, telling his biggest lies and attacking, transgender people and all these things, was the laughs from the audience. And that disturbed me. I mean, it wasn't, I'm sure all, but what bothers me when I see, either military or policing, a lot of the people that I used to work with or people that I see online, social media, is the going along and desensitizing and just getting further and further down the rabbit hole, which reminds me of, Weimar Republic of Germany, that, the police were the ones that were utilized on the street. And when I see ICE roundups and local police participating, that's kind of, it's history rhyming to me.
Yeah, really, it is really astonishing to see the normalization of the attack on law, and how some people who are in the business of law are willing to go along with these extraordinary activities. The idea that people showing up to a court proceeding or a naturalization proceeding would be just seized by people not showing their badge, not working with the local authorities, not talking to the courthouse saying, hey, we'd like to do a transfer of this prisoner into federal custody, just the normal things that have been going on for years in terms of how the federal and state, or even the federal governments deal with each other. And then to see, like the circumstance up a few weeks ago where the student was basically kidnapped off the street by people without uniforms on, with masks, putting her into a car, and how dangerous that is for everyone else walking around to not know. So when some car pulls up, are these kidnappers, or are these the kidnappers that are basically think that they're doing the bidding of the Department of Homeland Security in seizing people without, showing any sort of, proper credentials? And so I was going to ask you about this, Lisa, because I so appreciate your experience and your courage. When I was looking at the Posse Comitatus Act, one of the things that I looked at that really sort of blew my mind after John Roberts' decision to orchestrate the immunity from criminal prosecution for Trump was that Posse Comitatus is based on the idea that basically the law enforcement cannot be engaged in the military cannot be engaged in domestic law enforcement in a way that's illegal. And yet now Trump has this capacity to call something an official act where he issues an order. And then the penalty is sort of like, well, you won't get paid for doing it. If you do this Posse Comitatus seems inadequate to this moment, in part because we now have a president who has immunity from criminal prosecution. And I actually think, I don't know how we even, would stop someone from being paid for conducting an illegal raid, when in fact it seems like some of the activities the courts have found to be unlawful, if not illegal, but unlawful, and yet people are still being paid to enact this policy. So I don't. What are there rules? Are there state laws? Are there any places to help protect against the deployment of police and military in a Weimar Republic sort of way?
That's a great question, because some states and municipalities have tried to enact local ordinances, but the dry run for all these things, this has been happening for quite a while. We've been frogs boiling for a while. There's been the constitutional sheriff's movement that started, again, 10 years ago, and then we had similar activities in like Portland, during the racial justice protests, unmarked vans pulling up and people jumping out and grabbing citizens off the street. These kinds of things have been these dry runs, and I would argue with not a lot of pushback. And we've entered a period where citizens, and this is where police officers, military people say, well, we're just part of society too. And this is where we have to draw these lines, because there's so many people now with the thought process. I heard somebody say the other day, they're normalizing, actually, unbelievably, it was the Cato Institute. A gentleman in one of the Cato videos said they are normalizing the idea that we're going to float these ideas that maybe we all agree with, like, police officers, for instance. my whole career. It's frustrating to have to, dot your I's, cross your T's, and if you make a little mistake, somebody's going to, maybe not be convicted. But we've always understood that rule of law protected us too, and that we didn't get upset about that, but we're crossing a Rubicon to where we're saying, well, they're just criminals and we don't care anymore. And once you do that, because the person isn't convicted, it's maybe an accused person, maybe we have arrested them for probable cause, but they haven't been convicted in a court of law. A lot of these people that have been rounded up, they haven't gotten their day in court. And once you erase rule of law and the steps in our government, then nobody is safe, in my view. And to have military and law enforcement people buying into that is pretty dangerous to me.
Now, you would have thought after January 6th that watching this assault on Capitol Police, watching people physically maimed, eyes gouged, backs broken, activities that led to the death of Capitol Police officers, that the thin blue line, whatever, that there would be some sense of pushback from within law enforcement. And then if it didn't even kick in then, that when Trump pardoned these people and has lifted them up as heroes, that there would be some part of law enforcement that would push back. But what are you actually seeing? And what do you hear from, the folks that you communicate with in law enforcement?
Well, thankfully, there are, people like me that are aghast at all of this and trying to just raise the issue with our peers and talk to each other and remind each other that, hey, this isn't okay. But there's a striking number of people that I have just watched them jump all over those of us that try to say this was horrific. We cannot allow, this kind of thing to happen. People that attack law enforcement should be, and are convicted should be in prison. And there's a surprising number of, former and current law enforcement that, because of their political ideology, they're willing to suspend that. And what I realized is that watching January 6th was that for a certain segment of folks that are really diehard Trump supporters in law enforcement and in the military, they're willing to suspend that depending on who you're being asked to defend. So really, sadly, the Capitol Police were defending the wrong things in their view. And so then they're expendable. And that's really crushing to me. Yeah. I can only imagine what Michael Fanone and them feel like. I can't.
Yeah, and Harry Dunn. But
Yeah,
you've
Harry
seen
Dunn.
there are some veterans who are beginning to organize around these principles of the oath meaning something, the honor code meaning something.
Yeah.
You seeing
Yes,
it there?
yes. Yeah, there's a gentleman. His name's Chris Goldsmith on Substack. He runs an organization called Veterans Against Fascism, and I've sort of kind of tried to reach out and hook up with him. I've had some conversations with him, doing great work. I'd like to do something similar, with law enforcement. So if you're law enforcement adjacent or supportive, hit me up on Substack, and we'll start chatting about it, because I know there are good people still that just are afraid. They're just going along, keeping their heads down because it's become such a normal thing of this back the blue. But January 6th taught us that back the blue is only a political slogan. This new version of Republicans does not back the blue. They don't care.
It really is shocking, and sorry for that audio interruption. I was trying to find Chris Goldsmith's Memorial Day message because it was just so powerful. I'm so glad you mentioned him, Lisa, and really appreciate your initiative for law enforcement, because there really are so many people who are in the police who have come to those jobs to protect our communities and take seriously that duty to defend our Constitution and to defend the citizenry, although obviously not all, as we've seen emerging, even some of the people who were at January 6th, who were law enforcement, who were there coordinating with some of these groups that were dedicated to the overthrow of our government, basically. But there are so many. I feel like one of the things that not you, but that I can forget sometimes in the midst of all of this is that actually it's probably the case that the majority of people don't have these extreme beliefs, do not believe that January 6th was right, do not believe that law enforcement should be used to pick people up. Most people, in fact, the recent polling shows that most people really understand that due process means it should apply to all of us, because everyone's vulnerable. If there is no way to go to court and say, what are the charges against me? Is there any evidence to hold me?
Right.
And this dates back to the Magna Carta, to 1066, as a guarantee for liberty, that you just cannot have the executive or his agents picking people up without charges. And so I have to believe, and I continue to believe, that most Americans do not support this kind of extremism. And so I believe you have allies out there, Lisa, more than you know, more than we know, who I think, can join together in standing up against this effort to strip us of our most fundamental rights.
Yeah, I know that. I'm not giving up hope. I know that it's just, like our whole society right now, we're all finding our voice, and we all know there's more of us than them. We do, it's just a matter of in our own way, and the law enforcement way is my way of, going to try to make a mark on it.
Well, I think right now of the Vietnam veterans who came home and became protesters against that war, I think of Tiananmen Square, because we are creating that moment where, this is a president who has proposed using active duty military on protesters, suggested shooting migrants in the leg. I mean, all of these things that are just absolutely illegal. And I think we've got to mentally start preparing and strategically start preparing for the confrontations that will come as these illegal orders are given. Lisa, how can people find you? You've got something you're going to be launching soon on Substack.
Yes, I'm going to be launching. It's going to be a Square Cop in a Round World, and I'm going to be doing some writing and some video, just talking about these kinds of things and raising questions. You've heard me say for almost 20 years now, if we are brave enough to run to gunfire, we should be brave enough to have these hard conversations and talk about these things. So, and then you asked me earlier about Blue Sky, and I found it. I am at Lisa B-L .bluesky.social.
All right. There you go. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on the show and inviting people who want to organize, veterans who want to organize, police who are ready to stand up for the oath that they've taken. And we're gonna go to another topic, but you're perfectly welcome to stay with us as we begin to talk about one of the other places that the Project 2025 strategy is unfolding. So feel free to stick around for our next segment if you like, and we also won't be offended if you duck away.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. Wonderful. So this is a heavy show. Our shows aren't always quite this heavy, but there's just been so much. And this one, I have to confess to a little, I don't know, schadenfreude. There's a little bit of that in this story. So what we are seeing in this moment, you have to go back and remember that in the aftermath of those massive storms where the MAGA folks were criticizing Biden at every turn, saying he wasn't showing up and FEMA wasn't there, and none of it was true. None of it was true. But they went all in. And so people either believed, or too many people either believed one of two things: that FEMA hadn't shown up, or that FEMA was there on the ground, but if you accepted their help, the government would take your property, right? Even though these two things sort of can't be true at the same time, there you have it. So now, with the frequency and intensity of these massive weather events unfolding, and Trump in office, what's happening with FEMA? Well, FEMA's been gutted. There's the infrastructure for FEMA to show up has been gutted. But even more than that, Trump has, even to his, Huckabee, in Kansas, folks in Kentucky, he has basically said, no help is coming. I mean, he used to say it more like, I don't like your state. I don't like the politics of your state. So screw you, New York, and, go to hell, California. But this is just, it doesn't matter how many times, Sarah Huckabee applied her lips to his haunches. He still isn't coming up off a dime to help as their state is ravaged. And so this is just like Medicaid. You ask yourself, at what point will people realize that there is no that there's no bottom to which they will not sink, that there's no cruelty which they're not willing to inflict, whether you're Arkansas, North Carolina, Washington. And now we are in a time when they've gutted the early warning systems, they've gutted FEMA, they're advocating for states to assume greater responsibility. I was just talking the other day about the West Wing. Like, one of the things that you can't do in the middle of a crisis is go it alone. It requires, your roads are closed. You're in the middle by definition. But this undermines national disaster readiness, all of these things. At what point do people wake up and say, this can't work? We are a United States of America, not 50 individual fiefdoms. And when it comes to helping people in the middle of the most traumatic thing they can experience, we're just going to go tell them, good luck, because it isn't coming.
It really, it's astonishing in a way that they're getting away with this, but it is on this sort of salted earth where they've been attacking FEMA and causing the right-wing ecosphere has been causing people to have a irrational fear of FEMA. So much so that when that hurricane came, as far inland as, is it Asheville?
Yeah, Asheville.
Right, Asheville, North Carolina, that people were asking the volunteers who came in to help, were they with the Red Cross or were they with FEMA? And some of the people, there were reports that people who were armed and in response, the aid workers answered that they were with the Red Cross, not FEMA, because they feared for their own lives in coming to help, because there'd been such poisoning of people's minds about FEMA. It, in some ways, I think, like, I'm reading Chris Hayes' new book about, like, the most precious commodity is attention. And what's happened with this sort of 24-hour news cycle and Trump's domination of just attention is they are basically screwing people over community by community and getting away with it, because then the news has moved on to the next crisis and the next outrage and the next thing. And so they don't provide emergency aid. People are suffering. They're just fending for themselves. FEMA's not being deployed. It's not being deployed in a highly political way, but it's also not being deployed in a way that's like super arbitrary and, not actually how the governments work. And I hesitate to say this because, the notion of something being un-American has such a negative history because of McCarthyism, but that use of Un-American Activities Committee was just such a grotesque disregard for our First Amendment rights. But when I think about this FEMA situation, I think it is so profoundly un-American, so profoundly anti-American people to not deploy disaster aid. That is one of the president's responsibilities as commander-in-chief domestically, is to make sure that we help each other as fellow Americans when there are disasters, if there are fires, if there are hurricanes, if there are tornadoes. It doesn't matter how you voted. We all bleed red. We're all Americans. And I also think we need to be helping the world with our foreign aid and USAID, but domestically, the idea that they're getting away with not deploying our emergency capacity, the dollars that Congress already voted for
Yeah.
spending to protect us in times of emergency. And as you point out, Nadine, as emergencies are increasing because of the climate changes that are underway, it is deeply un-American. And
Yeah.
we need to call out those political leaders that are going along with this nonsense and denying we as Americans access to federal emergency aid. It is outlandish. And again, I'm going to go back to the beginning. We have to hold them accountable. I don't know how, given the gerrymandering and everything else, but we have got to make our voices heard and just politically punish any politician that goes along with or makes excuses for Trump's abdication of responsibility, for Kristi Noem's just incompetence as the head of the Department of Homeland Security in making sure that FEMA is going where the American people need it.
You've just reminded me of two things. One, first of all, you were pounding the table. That's a literal thing. But two, that we have to stop talking about this like it's a government. It's a criminal enterprise. The incompetence is tactical because they're not there to do these jobs. They're there to figure out how to grab as much cash as possible and pull it into their coffers. And so, of course, they're not going to do the hard work. But Lisa, you've been a first responder for forever, for decades. How do you react to hearing like, yeah, you're on your own?
I was just getting ready to say that, and that's part of my evolution, is realizing that how we do win this is going at it. You taught me this, Nadine, from so many different angles, and everybody thinks about it in terms of what they can understand or what's important to them. And this is what I tell cops. You're the one running into these situations. You're the one, they're calling 911, the police and fire. And if there's no money there, and if there's no equipment there, for you to do this safely, then what? So people have to understand that, they got, even the funding for NOAA, and we don't have any warning anymore with these storms, and first responders are out in the field while their families are home, hoping that, that it enrages me. Just I'm ready to pound on the table too.
We'll have to have a segment of table pounding.
I have a friend who said that I just need a rubber stamp that I can just stamp. That's outrageous all over the place. That's true, probably true. But there's so many outrages. Yeah,
there really are. But I will say this: I grew up in the Panhandle of Florida, where it's very conservative territory. Very racism, and sometimes when we say things are un-American, I think, nah, they're pretty American. That goes a long way. This kind of terrible attitudes are pretty American. But there is something in a disaster. It doesn't matter if a truck pulls up with Confederate flags. They're going to help you out of the ditch. Like in a hurricane, it would bring a community together. Like there's this shared value. I think of, I don't know, the Serengeti, where lions and giraffes and everyone knew that when this happened, you suspend any of those other things that divide us. And I think there's a value in there that we've got to start reminding each other of. And yeah, it's not going to come from Washington. It's not going to come from these completely incompetent to the jobs they hold, but completely competent to the jobs of gutting the federal government and lining the pockets of billionaires. They're very, very good at that. But we've got to start speaking back to these values about being neighbors to each other and looking out for each other. And because I think that deep down, there is a thing that people care about. And Elon Musk can tell people all day long that empathy makes us weak, but it is the thing, he should spend more time probably working on, I don't know, rockets that don't blow up, right? And I think his board of directors has now told him they want him to put in 40-hour weeks, by the way. And I immediately thought, and he should have to send a memo at the end of the week explaining what he did that week, right?
That created any value whatsoever.
Right, right. And so, but yes, I mean, I remember taking my camper across the country, and I had this malfunctioning thing to try and put up the air, and the trucker that stopped had a Trump shirt on, and I remember him going out of his way, like it felt like he needed to do extra to help, as a way of just saying, hey, can we still have these ties that bind in some way? So anyway, I'm not telling you that's the end of the cure for all of this is that we all go through a hurricane together and we'll find that special moment. But I do think that we've got to stop expecting any good, decent thing from them and start calling out that good and decent thing in each other despite them.
Yeah. Which is the honor code in law enforcement and military, right?
Yeah.
To remind them why they signed up in the first place, to do the right thing.
Yeah. All right. Now, speaking of not the right thing, we have tariffs, which
yes. Oh my gosh.
Tariffs, Tango Mango tariffs, tariff madness.
Okay.
So do you want to kick that off, Nadine?
I will, because if you have not seen this meltdown by Trump, in fact, because this happened like just today, he gets asked about he gets asked about the phrase taco trade. And if you're not familiar with this is a phrase, Trump always chickens out, that it has become so routine. The tariffs are on, the tariffs are off, the tariffs are on, the tariffs are off. They're on for a day, they're off for a day. In fact, it has become so routine that investors wait until he announces a tariff, knowing that the stock market will plunge. They buy the dip, and then they know that he will reverse himself. And so this, that you've got Trump when he starts calling you nasty. Like, to him, that's the worst thing he can say. That's a nasty comment. That's the nastiest thing you could say. You're a nasty person. Like, to him, you can almost see little Donald Trump being called nasty by, I don't know, his dad and his governess or whatever, and just having all of this trauma around this word. But yes, so taco trade, it is now, it's true because of how bigly he reacted to it. But you also have to ask yourself, again, just like we did during is he play fighting with Putin? Is Elon Musk play fighting with him for the theatrics of it to look a little bit like they have this, independence? Does he actually deploy these tariffs for the purpose of plunging the stock market for his buddies to scoop up, because we see tons of activity right before he makes a big announcement. There's all of this investigation about, who suddenly started trading right before he makes these big announcements. But yes, we are seeing a Trump always chickens out, being as routine as Taco Tuesday in any place. And again, it got under his skin in a way that, just like watching his nincompoop speech at West Point, you begin to wonder, how frayed at the edges, and how might we begin to ensure that more and more people are tuning into, the crime syndicate that is at the heart of everything that he does.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I was thinking, I'd like to invite Trump or challenge Trump to play poker with me, because I think that nasty is his tell. Like, several years ago, 2 decades ago, my mentor said to me, "Oh, you have no poker face, Lisa. Like, you can read me like a book. Like, my outrage."
Well, you start pounding the table when you've got aces.
Exactly. She said, "You really need to start playing poker because you need a poker face." But whenever Trump says something's nasty, it's like a confession that it's true. It's a confession. And I'd love to play poker in that environment, because his tells are just huge. And whenever a question is like the right question, the question that should be asked, that's when he calls it nasty, or that is exactly as you put it. And these tariffs are literally the dumbest tariffs in the history of America. Unless you're trying to just have this whole grift where it's this game where you're trying to take cash in and move these bubbles and try to work your way toward this cryptocurrency stuff with his other agenda. But like, from the standpoint of ordinary American people, this could not be dumber. And the way he announced it was stupid. And the countries that he listed, like the penguin countries, but not Russia, not Korea, it was dumb. Doing it by some sort of weird AI, which basically on the trade deficit versus reality and common sense trade policy. It's all a shakedown machine, which goes to your earlier point, Nadine, about like, how do we describe this administration? I think we need a different word than the Trump administration, because administration implies a sort of legitimacy, or rationality that is not manifest in the policies articulated by Trump. And, and then there's this component of it, like not just the trade thing, but I forgot to mention on the West Point thing, like just the senile-ish comments of Trump, like telling cadets about, trophy wives and yachts. It was like inappropriate, but it was also the sign of his mental, condition, that he cannot stay on message. Just like last week when he was, bragging about how our transportation secretary, decades ago climbed trees fast. Like these are all just diversions of his mental breakdown. And meanwhile, the media is obsessed with the fact that, Biden was aging and some of his closest people were trying to keep that out of the news. Meanwhile, we're seeing it in real time with Trump. And where's the editorial calling for his resignation? Where's the editorial calling for his cabinet to stand up to his mental meanderings while he has access to our nuclear codes and is playing this chicken, chickening out on trade? It's extraordinary.
Well, let me again thank our guest, Lisa Boving-Learned, for joining us. Catch up with her on Blue Sky and with her new Substack coming out, A Square Cop in a Round World. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Have a great night.
You too.
Thanks, Lisa.
And before we go, we like to, especially I think today, we want to make sure that we end with a segment we call Glass Half Full. It's not to ignore what is broken, but to remind ourselves of what's still beautiful, still bold, and still possible. It's a story or a moment or a movement that fills a cup even just a little. So if you are drinking with us this evening, prepare your goblet for our Glass Half Full segment. And our Glass Half Full, in this installment, is a quiet revolution that is taking place in corporate America that is sparked by people power. So some of the nation's biggest companies, they have to do this thing where they warn investors about risks to their portfolio. And now for the first time, they are warning investors that abandoning diversity, equity, and inclusion and sustainability can be financial liabilities, right? So in their SEC filings, Walmart, Target, Constellation Brands, Home Depot are now citing the backlash to the elimination of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs as a material risk, right alongside data breaches and supply chain shocks and the taco tariff, mango, dance. And there's data that is showing that Gen Z, they want brands. 83% want brands to take a stand on social issues. Corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are linked to improved employee retention, stock improvement, brand loyalty, all of these good outcomes. And the companies that have walked back their diversity, equity, inclusion, or their commitments around climate change are facing real world consequences, boycotts. The law firms that capitulated to Trump, massive resignations of their top talent, and also being fired by longtime clients are going, I don't want a coward as my attorney, and long-term brand damage. So the financial risks are becoming clearer and clearer. And, they're not saying this because of altruism. It's self-preservation. And we are seeing that people-powered reactions to the cowardice of companies that have absolutely, they went from saying these are values of ours to going, oh, those are just marketing that, we can dispense with. So to all of the people who are holding companies accountable, withholding their dollars from those cowards, I say, hoist your glass to a glass half full. Cheers. Now this is an attractive bottle, not a sponsor. I really wish I had the ability to, when people can just like tip it back and like drink the whole thing and then like smash the can on their forehead. I had the impulse to do that and the wisdom not to.
That's excellent. For the record, this is not a full glass of vodka. It's just
Sure.
sparkling water.
Sure, Lisa.
I know.
Whatever. If that's what you want to say, I'm going
I
to
know.
back you 100%.
But I toast the glass half full to everyone, and thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. I'm Nadine Smith alongside Lisa Graves. Thanks for making space for the 5, 8 and a half, your midweek breather. If you didn't get a chance to hit the subscribe button, take a moment, do so now. And most importantly, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and we will see you next Wednesday at 8, and tune in to the 5-8 on Fridays. Thanks for joining us.